Creepypasta, The Shadow on the Highway, my most unsettling drive ever. It happened a few years ago, but I still find myself thinking about it at odd moments, like when I'm on a long drive home, or when I catch a glimpse of my rearview mirror at night. The memory creeps up on me, uninvited, and suddenly, I'm back on that lonely highway, my heart pounding as if it's all happening again. At the time, I was living in a small town, working a boring office job that barely paid enough to cover rent and food. The kind of job that you can't exactly hate but certainly don't love either. The routine was suffocating, and the quietness of life in a rural area amplified the monotony. Everyone I knew either worked with me or had already moved on to bigger, better things in the city, leaving me behind in a town that felt too small for my ambitions. One of the few things I looked forward to were weekend trips to visit my old friend, Kate. She'd moved to the city right after college and had a small but cozy apartment where she'd host casual dinners or movie nights. I'd drive out there at least once or twice a month to unwind. It was a bit of a trek, about 2 hours each way, but I didn't mind the drive. It gave me time to clear my head, to think without distractions. That night, the night everything happened, I had stayed at Kate's later than usual. We'd lost track of time, chatting about old times, catching up on the bits of each other's lives that didn't fit into our daily texts. When I glanced at the clock, it was already close to 11 p.m., and I groaned. I wasn't thrilled about driving back so late, especially since the highway I usually took was notoriously isolated. Still, I figured I'd done it before, and I'd do it again. How bad could it be? "I wish you'd just crash on the couch," Kate had said as she leaned against the doorframe, watching me gather my things. "You know you're always welcome." I smiled and shook my head. "I have work in the morning. I'll be fine, though. I've done the late night drive a million times." She gave me a skeptical look, but eventually relented with a sigh. "Text me when you get home, okay? I mean it. If you forget, I'm calling you at 3 a.m. We both laughed, and I promised her I'd be careful. The drive started off uneventfully, as it always did. The city lights gradually faded behind me, replaced by the familiar expanse of darkness that lined the highway. I kept the radio on, flipping between stations as they faded in and out of range. Every now and then, a truck would pass by, its headlights illuminating the road just long enough to remind me that I wasn't completely alone out there. The highway, for the most part, cut through long stretches of farmland and forest. By day, it was a scenic route, peaceful and wide open, with fields of corn and wheat stretching out to the horizon. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches twisting and bending in the wind like skeletal fingers. The fields, once golden and inviting, became dark oceans, hiding whatever might be lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. About 30 minutes into the drive, I started to feel the weight of the day pressing down on me. My eyelids felt heavy, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt wasn't helping. I glanced at the clock, 11:30 p.m. I had at least an hour left to go, but already, I could feel fatigue creeping up on me. I rolled down the window a crack, hoping the cool night air would keep me awake. It helped, but not much. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a vague shape in the distance, standing on the side of the road. I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, and I instinctively slowed down. As I got closer, though, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. He was standing right at the edge of the highway, his body barely illuminated by the dim glow of my headlights. He didn't move as I approached. He just stood there, staring out into the darkness, his figure unnervingly still. The rational part of my brain told me to keep driving, to not even think about stopping. But curiosity, and maybe a little concern, got the better of me. What was someone doing out here, at this time of night, in the middle of nowhere? Was he lost? Did he need help? I slowed down even more, rolling past him at a cautious pace. As I did, I caught a better glimpse of him. He was tall, with a long, dark coat that flapped slightly in the wind. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, making it impossible to see his features clearly. But what unsettled me most was the way he was standing, completely still, arms hanging limply at his sides, head slightly tilted down as if he was waiting. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively glanced at my rearview mirror as I passed him. For a split second, I saw his face. Or rather, I saw the lack of expression on it. His eyes, dark, empty pits, were locked onto me, staring through the mirror, directly at me. I felt a rush of cold fear sweep over me, like a bucket of ice water being poured down my back. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I forced myself to look away, my heart hammering in my chest. He wasn't waving me down, wasn't making any move to flag me for help. He was just standing there, staring at me, like he had been waiting for me specifically. Like he had been expecting me. By the time I looked back in the mirror, he was gone. Vanished into the night. I sped up, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Who was that man? I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. Maybe he was just some drifter, a hitchhiker who had gotten stranded in the middle of nowhere. But the way he had looked at me. It felt personal. Like he knew me somehow, even though I'd never seen him before in my life. I kept driving, pushing the unsettling encounter to the back of my mind. After all, what could I do? I couldn't stop and turn around. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on me, making everything feel claustrophobic. Another 10 minutes passed, and I started to relax a little, convincing myself it had just been a weird coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting. I was tired, after all. Exhaustion could make people see things, misinterpret things. That had to be it. It had to be. But then, just as I started to feel my heartbeat return to normal, I saw him again. Standing on the side of the road. Exactly the same as before, motionless, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly down. Waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed down hard on the gas, speeding past him without a second glance. How was he there? I hadn't turned off the highway, I hadn't changed routes. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Not unless he had a car, but there had been no sign of one. And even if he did have a car, how could he have driven ahead of me so quickly? I glanced in the rearview mirror again, my pulse racing. This time, I didn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. That same, empty stare boring into the back of my skull, like he was watching my every move. I drove faster, the engine roaring beneath me as I flew down the highway. The trees blurred past in the darkness, and the only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. For the next several miles, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see him again. But he didn't reappear. Not on the side of the road, not in the shadows. For a while, it seemed like he was gone. I started to calm down, though the fear still lingered in the back of my mind. Then the worst thing happened. The headlights of a large truck appeared in my rearview mirror, approaching fast. It wasn't unusual to see trucks on this highway, but this one was moving aggressively. I watched as it got closer and closer, closing the distance between us at an alarming speed. I glanced over my shoulder, hoping the driver would just pass me, but something was wrong. The truck wasn't slowing down. In fact, it was accelerating, barreling toward me as if it had no intention of stopping. I swerved into the next lane, narrowly avoiding a collision. The truck roared past me, horn blaring, the force of the wind shaking my car. But just as I thought it was over, I saw something that nearly made my heart stop. Standing on the side of the road, right where the truck had been seconds ago, was the man. The same man. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. This time, there was no mistaking it, he was following me. Or worse, he was ahead of me, waiting for me. But how? How was he appearing ahead of my car every few miles, standing on the roadside like some eerie sentry, always watching? I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to outrun the panic crawling up my spine. The highway stretched endlessly before me, but my mind couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving straight into something worse. My phone sat in the cup holder next to me, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the road long enough to grab it. I wasn't sure what I'd even say if I called someone. I tried to rationalize it again. I had to be hallucinating from fatigue. I hadn't slept much the night before, and maybe the late hours were playing tricks on me. But hallucinations don't make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They don't leave you gripping the steering wheel so tight your hands ache. This was different. It was real. Minutes passed, the darkness outside growing deeper and more oppressive. The radio stations had faded into static long ago, so I drove in silence, the low rumble of the car's engine the only sound keeping me company. Every so often, I'd flick a glance at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing. Just when I thought I might be safe, I saw something ahead, a figure standing directly in the middle of the highway this time. My heart lurched into my throat. It was him again. I hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just a few feet in front of him. The man didn't move. He stood there, staring at me with that same unnerving stillness, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. His long coat flapped slightly in the wind, but everything else about him was motionless, as though he were carved out of stone. I sat there, frozen, my hands trembling on the wheel. What did he want? Why was he here, in the middle of the road, staring at me like he was expecting something? For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, me in the car, him in the road. Finally, he moved. But not the way I expected. Instead of walking toward me or stepping aside to let me pass, he lifted his hand and pointed to the road ahead. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his arm and pointed to something beyond the reach of my headlights. I followed the direction of his hand, squinting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the empty stretch of highway. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it, a narrow dirt road, nearly invisible in the shadows, branching off from the highway. It was small and unmarked, with no signs or lights, leading into the dense woods that flanked the road. I shook my head. There was no way I was going down that road. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to reverse and get the hell out of there. But something about the way the man stood, pointing silently toward that path, made it clear he wouldn't let me pass unless I did what he wanted. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to go down that road. But I didn't want to stay here, either. With trembling hands, I shifted the car into gear and reluctantly turned the wheel, guiding it onto the dirt path. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as I left the highway behind, the narrow road closing in around me as the trees loomed overhead. The farther I drove, the more the feeling of isolation grew. The darkness here was thicker, more suffocating, and the dirt road was uneven, making the car lurch and bounce as I navigated the narrow turns. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man walking behind me, but the road remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the woods. My headlights barely illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel, figures shifting in the darkness just beyond the trees, but I told myself it was my imagination. It had to be. After what felt like an eternity, the road widened, and I found myself in a small clearing. There, at the center, was an old, decrepit house. It looked abandoned, its windows were shattered, the wooden boards rotted and sagging, and the roof caved in on one side. Weeds and vines had overtaken the porch, winding their way up the crumbling walls. The entire place reeked of neglect and decay, like it had been forgotten by the world for decades. I didn't want to get out of the car. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never look back. But some unseen force seemed to compel me, pulling me toward the house. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the door handle, and before I knew it, I was stepping out into the cold night air. The silence was deafening. No insects, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing, harsh and uneven. I took a hesitant step toward the house, then another. My feet felt heavy, as if the very ground was trying to pull me down. The door to the house was slightly ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the wind. I stood in front of it, staring into the blackness beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw movement inside, just a flicker of shadow, barely noticeable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, ready to run. Then, I heard it. A voice. Faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Come inside." I froze. The voice was soft, almost comforting, but there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whisper called to me again, beckoning me closer. "Come inside." Before I could stop myself, I stepped over the threshold and into the house. The air inside was thick and stale, filled with the scent of mildew and rot. The floor creaked under my weight, each step echoing through the empty halls. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the weak beam of my phone's flashlight. As I ventured deeper into the house, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was all around me now, coming from every direction, filling my head with words I couldn't quite understand. And then I saw him. Standing at the end of the hallway, his figure barely visible in the dim light, was the man from the highway. My blood ran cold. He stood there, motionless, just as he had on the road. His face was still obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, their words twisting and warping until they became a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. Then, without warning, the man moved. He stepped forward, his footsteps unnaturally quiet on the old wooden floor. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and I could finally understand what they were saying. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, racing down the hallway and out the front door. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in the car, slamming the door shut behind me. I floored the gas, speeding back down the dirt road as fast as I could, the house and the man disappearing into the darkness behind me. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't slow down. I drove straight home, my hands shaking, my mind racing with 100 unanswered questions. I never saw the man again. I never went back to that stretch of highway, either. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I can still hear the whispers. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed these Reddit stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.